Could everyone please find their seats? All right. Good morning, everyone. There we go. Let's try that one more time. Good morning, everyone. There we go. Now I have your attention. Thank you. My name is Bobby Lapin, and I have the great privilege of serving as the chair of AJC's Contemporary Jewish Life Commission. And I am absolutely delighted to welcome each of you to what I know is going to be a very timely and relevant AJC University session this morning, which we are calling Israel-Diaspora Relations, a New Status Quo. As many of you may know, in 1950, then AJC President Jacob Blaustein and Israel's founding Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion reached a landmark agreement laying a foundation for Israel-Diaspora relations. The parameters of their agreement were clear. Israel would not interfere with American Jewry, question the allegiance of American Jews to the United States, or summon them to Israel. In return, the American side of the bargain was that American Jews would give generously and advocate on behalf of Israel and on behalf of Israeli security, but would do so without meddling in Israeli internal politics or policy. This agreement recognized that the Jewish communities in the diaspora and in Israel should not merely coexist, but cooperate. Now let's fast forward 45 years. In 1995, as American Jews weighed in on the direction of the then Israeli-Palestinian peace process, with some seeking to hit the brakes and others favoring further steps down the Oslo path. And as debates arose with regard to the degree to which Israel embraced or rejected religious pluralism, a rift of sorts began to emerge between the Jewish state and American Jewry. Now, let's fast forward another 24 years hence. Divisions between the world's two largest Jewish communities, between them comprising 85% of all the world's Jewry, appear even more significant and more polarized. What used to be private discussions on this topic now spill out into the public domain. Israeli government policies and U.S.-Israeli relations generate debate now not only in the American political and media communities, but also in our synagogues, in our communal institutions, and indeed, for many of us, around the family Shabbat dinner table. It's pretty hard now, I think it's fair to say, to escape the conclusion that the Israeli-diaspora relationship, while still strong and politically potent, nonetheless remains a topic of significant importance and, at times, controversy in our community. So the question must be asked, how can we reverse the trend, and can we reverse the trend? Happily, and I think each of you all have copies on your chair this morning, AJC just released its first ever concurrent surveys of the attitudes of Jews in France, Israel, and the United States, the world's three largest Jewish communities. And the results, some of the results at least, to say the least, are both challenging and ominous. When asked about the future of Israeli-diaspora relations, U.S. and French Jews were far more pessimistic than Israeli Jews. Those Jews who foresee a weakening of transnational ties over the next 5 years outnumber those who anticipate stronger ties by 24 to 18% in the U.S. and by 32 to 24% in France. Among Israelis, though, 30% expect stronger ties, while 23% think that they will weaken. Now, lest I put you in too sour of a mood, here's some good news about the vitality of the Jewish people. This same survey also found that most Jews in all three communities do agree that being Jewish is very important in their lives, and that both a thriving Israel and a thriving diaspora are vital for the long-term world Jewish future and for their Jewish future. So I encourage you to take a copy of the survey and please read it. Copies will also be available outside in the cafe next door and on some of the ballroom tables for those who may not be able to, or who didn't attend this session and would like to have a copy of them. So now let me give you one more bit of better news, and that is you're about to hear from a distinguished panel of experts who have each grappled with these issues from their own vantage points and their own professional positions. And over the course of this session, they will very much help us evaluate the status and the future of Israeli-diaspora relations. Their bios are in your AJC Global Forum program, so I won't burn any of our precious time by spending the time now to detail for you their impressive credentials or accomplishments. So instead, with their indulgence, I'll simply identify them for you so that we can maximize the time for this session and we can all learn from them. Ambassador Dani Dayan is the Consul General for Israel here in New York, not here, but in New York. Dan Feferman is a fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute, a public policy think tank geared toward the security of Israel and the Jewish people. Abigail Pogrebin is the author of Stars of David and My Jewish Years, 18 Holidays, One Wandering Jew. And Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove is the senior rabbi at Park Avenue Synagogue in New York. Facilitating and moderating what I know will be a fascinating conversation is our own special Star of David in his own right, Dr. Steve Bayme, AJC's Director of Contemporary Jewish Life, and my cherished partner in the work of the AJC Contemporary Jewish Life Commission. So Steve, as I turn the floor over to your capable hands, I ask everyone to please join me in giving our guests a very warm welcome.
You want us anywhere, Steve? Or just,
Thank you, Bobby. Good morning to everyone. The size of the audience today is a reflection of how hot the subject is in Jewish life. Certainly hardly a week passes without some major firestorm or some major analysis saying the two communities are drifting apart. But this morning, as Bobby mentioned, you have a very sharp illustration in the AJC surveys. One particular barometer is the question of how do American Jews and Israelis evaluate President Trump, not in terms of his overall performance, but in terms of his handling of U.S.-Israel relations. Among Israelis, Israeli Jews, 79% feel he has handled the U.S.-Israel relationship very appropriately. Among American Jews, 59% disapprove of his handling. If that's not a chasm, I don't know what would be. Usually there are three basic reasons ascribed to the chasm. One is the reality of assimilation among American Jews. If you're distant from matters Jewish in general, you're going to be distant from Israel. Two, without question, and Bobby mentioned this, is there's a significant dismay, disappointment at times with the conduct of Israeli policies and how they affect the diaspora. But three, the political culture of our two communities really is drifting apart. American Jews incline towards an overall liberal universalism. That means, on the one hand, obviously voting for more liberal candidates, but also means a value system that places a great deal of emphasis upon the universal society, the pursuit of the universal. Israelis, by dint of history and by dint of the reality of the Middle East, often take a much more particularistic and more conservative approach to things. There's no denying Israel since '67 has gradually been moving rightward. American Jews, the liberal consensus has prevailed really for over 100 years at this point, certainly since the election of 1928, the Alfred Smith New Deal coalition. So in that light, I'd like to turn to our distinguished panelists. We'll have discussion among themselves for about half an hour, 35 minutes. We'll then open it up for audience participation, and we'll close in approximately an hour. I'd like to toss a question to all of you. Bobby Lapin mentioned the Ben-Gurion-Blaustein agreement, an agreement back in 1951 that called for U.S. support, American Jewish support for Israel, but also an agreement of let's not interfere in one another's affairs. A year ago, at our global forum in Jerusalem, first time we met in Jerusalem, a symbolic statement in itself, many of us went to see President Rivlin, who called for a reassessment, a reevaluation of the Ben-Gurion-Blaustein agreement. If you were to think in terms of what should that agreement comprise today, what would be your basic principles? What do you think should govern, if you will, relations between American Jewry and Israel? Toss it up to all of you. Ambassador Dayan, would you like to go first?
Well, thank you. You know, it's quite naive to believe that an agreement between Jews that was forged 70 years ago, more or less, can be relevant today. Israel is a different country than it was 70 years ago. The American Jewish community is different, completely different than it was then. And I personally disagree with the basic precept. I think that in a family, and I see us as a family, you are not only allowed to interfere or to make known your opinion on the other part's behavior or interests or policy, it's part of your duty. But we have here to differentiate very clearly between two things. I think that's one of the most basic distinctions we have to make. When we speak about Jewish American, again, interference, quote unquote, in Israeli life, we have to make a clear distinction between rights and positions. Rights are indisputable, should be indisputable. A right for to pray or to perform religious life as they want in in Israel should be a question that should not be debatable. A right is a right, period. When it comes to positions, that's a completely different story. I believe that American Jews have a right to make clear their opinion. By the way, there are diverse opinions. I don't think that there is an American Jewry opinion on Palestinian, in the Palestinian issue, in the Iranian deal. They are entitled to make it clear, to voice it, even to lobby for it. But the decisions should be made exclusively by Israelis. And that is a clear distinction that sometimes we don't make it clear enough. The distinction between the rights of American Jewry in the Jewish state and the ways to influence in political positions. And the fact that we sometimes bundle the two together is detrimental to both.
Okay, we seem to be having some problems with the audio.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's hold this.
Here's the opinions.
Okay. Okay. Too late, but.
All right. The wonders of technology. I've always marveled at how we aim for
What
the
you
best.
said was very beautiful.
If I can just press.
Yeah, we want to give you.
If I could just press, Ambassador Dayan is basically saying that we have a right to express our positions. Decisions must be made by Israel. Perfectly understandable. Abby, I'd like to perhaps push it back to you, though. You've written about American Jewish life, specifically about millennials drifting away from Israel. They're the ones who often complain that dissent from Israeli policy cannot be heard within the American Jewish establishments, within American Jewish forums. Given what Ambassador Dayan just said, express your position, but realize that matters of Israeli national interest will be determined by the Israelis. It would seem to me the natural conclusion is that no one is preventing millennials from expressing their position. They just can't expect that position will always be echoed by the Israeli government.
It's a nice small question for the morning. First of all, thank you for being here. I'm lucky enough to study with Dr. Bayme and his quiet lunch series, and I've gleaned so much from you. I would just say that in addition to being a journalist in the Jewish world, some of you may know I was privileged to be president of Central Synagogue in New York for 3 years. And that was a very different hat to wear, but an important one for your question, because we are obviously a proud and numerous Reform synagogue with great history and what we consider to be great dedication and devotion, not just proud Zionists, but proud Jews. So the language that we often have heard, particularly in the last couple of years, coming from the chief rabbinate and certain ministers, that we don't count as authentic Jews. And I'm not just talking about kind of going and crying about the wall, which we can agree or disagree about how much that matters, but genuinely that a Reformed Jew is not a Jew. It is not only painful, but it is, I think, very difficult to kind of then embrace, understand, send planes and checks to a place we love that kind of doesn't legitimize us as full Jews. And that's what I would just say for my cohort in terms of if there was going to be another agreement. I wish there was an agreement that we are not going to, when we are such a tiny people, be so invested in splintering ourselves further. I don't see where it gets us, and I actually think it gives us that extra hurdle in terms of not just love for Israel, but investment in time to say, why am I caring about a place despite the fact that actually my very attachment to my heritage is discounted? So I think that's just an important point to address. And then the other part I would just say more journalistically, and when I was doing the Jewish Holidays book, is, you know, with whether you're looking at reform, everyone except those who are kind of yeshiva raised, is that the substance of people's Judaism in America, I think, is particularly millennials, is flimsy in many cases, if we're going to be frank about it. And we keep hearing, and I often, because I love AJC, hear so much anxiety about whether we're sending our kids off armed to defend Israel, and not so much whether we're sending them off as proud Jews who know what Judaism stands for, what our tradition says. When we hear about Jewish values, where they come from, in text, in tradition, not necessarily to have yeshiva educations, but to have I think what all of your studies show is that you care about Israel when you care about being Jewish. And to me, that needs to be, in a way, part of the agreement, unspoken or spoken.
Interesting point. Thank
you.
Abby is suggesting perhaps one-liner, more Judaism, less talking points. Does that sound good? Elliot, if we just pick up on that, you've written a sermon last couple of weeks, which you argue that what are we talking about when we really talk about Israel? We're really talking about our own shortcomings as Jews. Would you want to elaborate on that?
Sure. Everyone hear me?
Oh, sorry.
How about now? Can people hear me now?
Elliot, they want you to give a sermon.
Yeah, I don't think you want a congregational rabbi to stand up because
He'll never sit down.
I'll never sit down. So, just what Steve's. First of all, it's awesome to be on. I feel like I should have trading cards of great Jews and Dr. Bayme, not only probably the smartest Jew I know, but the kindest, and what an honor it is to be here with you today. So, look, I made the point in an article I recently wrote about what Jews are talking about when they're talking about Israel, is we're not talking about Israel in so much as we're talking about the shortcomings of our own Jewish identity and our own Jewish community. I think right now we are living in a moment, 70 plus years post-Shoah, 70 plus years of blessed American Jewry, and 70 odd years of a sovereign state of Israel. And this mixture altogether of historic, and I'm alluding to things that you brought up, of historical allegiance to liberal causes, of vulnerability, of exile, of course, the capstone horrifically being the Shoah. Jews feel vulnerable. It's part of our DNA. We also are celebrating a powerful sovereign state where the equation of who's the David and who's the Goliath is upended, not just in our own mind, but in the mind of everyone around us. And the whole question of how to reconcile, square the circle of the fact that we are this historically vulnerable, powerless people, and enjoy. I mean, Jews have become white people along the way. We are a privileged class, and so you put this all together, and it's very, very complicated. And so we argue over Israel because Israel is the most public manifestation of Jewish identity we have, and we love it. We want our kids to go on Birthright, and we're worried about the Iran deal, and we're worried about all the things we should be. And we know as Jews that to be Jewish today and not be engaged in an advocate on behalf of the state of Israel is to abdicate what it means to be a Jew. At the same time, as Abby just so eloquently put it, to support Israel doth not equal a vibrant Jewish life. These are two separate things. And so we argue about the emergence of two different Jewish communities. We argue over whether we are allowed to influence or simply have an opinion about what's going on in Israel. And we call people out by names as either self-hating Jews or as colonialist oppressors, because it's much easier to do that than to worry about the Jewish identity of our children and our grandchildren. It's much easier to write a check, and I write a check to AJC and my own organizations, but it's much easier to do that than it is to light Shabbos candles and keep your kids home on a Friday night. And I think if the Jewish community spent more time doing what my friend here said, which is worrying about the substance of our Jewish identity, and less time name-calling, ultimately it would be good for American Jewry. And as Vince Lombardi said, the best defense is a good offense. I think it would be better for our relationship with Israel.
Dan, I know you've published a recent book, which I really want to recommend to everyone. It's called Rising Streams, Reform and Conservative Judaism in Israel. The book has been read, certainly in my circles, in two very different ways. The Reform and Conservative movements, both Abby and Elliot are representatives of the two main liberal movements, largely have read this as saying that if 5% of Israelis identified with the Reform and Conservative movements 10 years ago, it's up to 13% today. That sounds great. Sounds like, in effect, for every Haredi Jew, there's one Reform or Conservative Jew in Israel. That's been one reading of the book, that it's given a shot in the arm to the sense of the two movements as being weak or irrelevant to Israeli society.
Steve, use the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. The book seems to be a refutation of that. The other part of the book, or the one that the other reading of it, is that it's not the Reform and Conservative movements that are rising in Israel. The title is Rising Streams, meaning that there's a kind of post-Reform, post-secular, post-Orthodox developments in Israel that are not the mirror image of Reform and Conservative Judaism in Israel, but rather a pluralism that is distinctively Israeli forms. I'd like you to comment. You've heard so much of the dismay articulated by American Jews. Abby put it, I think, very well. Does Israel recognize me as a Jew? Does it recognize my Jewish identity? In terms of what's going on in terms of Israeli Jewish identification, is there an acceptance of the right to be different, which is the American version, or is it that these movements simply are irrelevant to us and you're bothering us with your problems? In other words, just to clarify the point for a second, American Jews are outspoken about how their movements are not recognized, the monopoly of the chief rabbinate on matters of personal status. That's a sense what Abby is saying, you don't recognize my Jewishness. The other part of it, is those Israelis who are saying, that's not my problem. I'm concerned about security. I'm concerned about the economy. The Kotel doesn't mean anything to me. If I want Jewishness, I turn to other forms that might be called these post-secular forms of Jewishness. Would you want to comment on that?
Sure. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Honored to be here, included among this panel and speaking here. Thank you for having me. I think your reading of my book on that is very accurate. Israelis, a growing number of secular and traditional Israelis are, we can call it post-secular, post-Orthodox, and they're connecting to these pluralistic liberal versions of Judaism in a broader sense. They are not identifying with the organizations, with the reform movement, with the conservative movement in Israel. Those are, after an extensive study, those are small. They're growing, but they are small movements within Israel. And what is happening is Israelis, in large part, are post-halachic, we'll call it that. They don't care about the details of how you do Jewish. They want to do it their way, and I think this is a broader generational shift. As to American Jews, specifically Reform and Conservative American Jews, I would say, what do you care what the rabbis in Israel think of you? Do your Judaism. You don't, you love or don't love Israel, or you should, because it's Israel, not because of Israelis. One of the things somebody told me when they made Aliyah years ago was, you're not going to Israel to become Israeli. You're going to Israel because it's Israel. And in that sense, don't worry about what the chief rabbinate says. Don't worry about what the ultra-Orthodox rabbis say, because the ultra-Orthodox rabbis here in the United States probably also don't recognize your Judaism. They might recognize you as Jews. And by the way, every ultra-Orthodox rabbi in Israel has said this. We recognize our Reform and conservative brothers and sisters as Jews. They don't recognize that type of Judaism as Judaism. Who cares?
Can
Right?
I answer that?
Absolutely.
I would say who cares? And because you also don't recognize or you don't identify with their type of Judaism, and that's okay. And I think every Jew as an individual, every group, every movement needs to advance a positive version of their own Jewish vision, of their ideology, what it means, and how you connect with Israel, and how you connect with Jewish law, and how you grapple with Jewish tradition, how you grapple with Jewish text, modernity, the complications of living in Israel in constant conflict. Israelis on the ground are worried about other things. It's not just security. I think they use that too often as an excuse. It's not just about security. They care about the marriage issue. They care about businesses being open or closed on Shabbat. Okay? They care about, to a lesser extent, conversion, and to an even lesser extent, the Kotel. That's an issue for American Jews. Israeli secular Jews, with the exception of a handful, and I'm saying this with no kind of disrespect, with the exception of a handful of Reform conservative women of the wall protesters who go on Rosh Chodesh, on the first of the month, to the Kotel to protest, secular Israelis don't care about the Kotel. It's a symbol. They're not going there. They care about marriage. And so, you can connect to how Israelis are approaching these issues and fighting for their rights and for their freedoms. It's a big enough disagreement within Israel itself that you can pick your sides and support them. But I think the big issue is, who cares what they say? Focus on your own Judaism and on your connection to Israel.
Abby?
So I like Dan. I am focused on my own Judaism, and when I'm sitting on Friday night in a synagogue where there's 2,500 families and there's 800 on a Friday night, I'm pretty content with the robustness of our observance, and we're speaking Hebrew, which is a shock maybe to some people. But when you hear language that Reform Jews are actually akin to Holocaust deniers, that's not just the reality of your Judaism. Those are fighting words. They are demeaning, and they have power, more power, I would say, than we're not as affected in terms of decision-making and governance in America by whatever is akin to the chief rabbinate in America is not controlling our marriages, our burials, our conversions. So in that sense, there is a different power weight and shift that matters in terms of the character of a country that we love and want to defend.
My late father used to advise me many, many years ago. He said, he never discusses religion, he never discusses politics. I get to Israel my first trip in 1971, and I discovered all that's being discussed is either religion or politics. So if we can turn to a couple of political questions, I'd like to go back to Ambassador Dayan and this morning's poll. This morning's poll indicates that two-thirds of American Jews favor a two-state solution. Two-thirds of American Jews believe Israel should be willing to dismantle some or all of the settlements. Same question was asked of Israeli Jews. 51% oppose a two-state solution, and 50% do not believe any settlements should be dismantled. Ambassador Dayan, that looks to me like a political chasm, between us.
Yeah, but it's not the only one. I mean, look, it's one of, we are different. Look, we are different. We are different politically, we are different sociologically. In some senses, we are even different ethnically. Jews in Israel arrived from different countries, generally speaking, than American Jews. And the most important thing, we had different strategies to build our society. We had to build our Jewish society on the grounds of establishing a state, designing it, defending it against very powerful attacks. You have a strategy of blending into an existing an existing welcoming society. Those are completely different strategies of survival. Those are completely different strategies of developing your character. That's the reason that I think that the fact that we are so similar in spite of those differences, those extreme differences, that is the good news. And look, the big question here is not if we agree or not. You know, Jews made a lot of contributions to humanity. Agreeing among ourselves on important matters was not of the Jewish contributions to the world. Now, the question is if there is solidarity between us in spite of the differences. If we were the same, there is no question. We are different. Yes, we are different. It's almost natural. It would be unnatural if we would be the same pattern. The question if we can show solidarity with one another when the central Jewish value in this country is tikkun olam. You know the joke. How do you say tikkun olam in Hebrew? Because we Israelis believe it's an American word, tikkun olam. And the basic Jewish value of the Israeli Jews is Shivat Zion, the return to Zion. So the question is in spite of that big difference, we can show solidarity with one another. And you know, if we do not show solidarity with one another, then we have a big problem. Because then we will have, you know, my definition of a Jew is very simple. A Jew is a person that every year, when the Nobel Prizes are announced, checks how many Jews are among the recipients. And when God forbid, an aircraft crashes in its way from London to Moscow, checks how many Jews were in the list of passengers. That is a Jew. Now, the question of solidarity between Jewish America and Jewish Israel is even more challenging. And I want to say here the following to wrap it up. If we, God forbid, lose our sense of solidarity with one another, because Jewishness ultimately is about that. Why we say we are not only a religion, but we are also a people? Because we have solidarity with one another. That's what makes us a people, not only a religion. Otherwise, it's the same as Catholicism or Episcopalianism, that it's only a religion. But since we have a sense of solidarity with one another, we are a nation. Now, if we lose that, that means we will become two different people. And if, God forbids, that happens, that we become two different people, then history shows that, you will not like what I'm going to say now. History shows that every time that the Jewish people split, one of the parts we lost it for the Jewish people. And I have my assumption in that case, which one of the parts of the Jewish people, which side of the ocean will be that, but will not prevail. That's the reason we have to, you know, we are Jews, but we marry like Catholics. We have no divorce in our marriage. We may need a lot of marital counseling, but definitely the word divorce should be out of this table.
Abby, Elliot, I'd like you both to reflect on, you both lead in different ways two of the largest congregations and most important congregations in the metropolitan New York City area. If we push this issue of solidarity one step further, again, this morning's poll indicated that 25% of American Jews are deeply opposed to the notion of dismantling no settlements whatsoever. The Prime Minister, during the electoral campaign, made a promise that no settlements would be dismantled, either within the settlement blocks or, for that matter, deeper within the West Bank. Let's say hypothetically that is actually what took place, that Israel took action annexing or extending Israeli sovereignty overt settlements on the West Bank. How do you think your congregants would react based on this, this question of, well, is there solidarity or is this too divisive for us?
I think it would be very bad. And you didn't answer the question.
That's all.
I think that we are watching the two-state solution die on the vine. I think it's not happening all in one fell swoop, but there are a series of legislative, political, governmental actions that are euthanizing the two-state solution before our very eyes. And if I could blend the comments of my colleagues, I think it is because for American Jews, the value of democracy is part and parcel to who we are, that when the greatest public manifestation of Jewish identity, the state of Israel, finds itself at odds with the notion of democracy, that is very bad. And if you think about the non-response of American Jewry, I was very proud to be at the embassy dedication, but what was most remarkable about it was the silence of American Jewry at that moment, or even the Golan decision. And I think these non-responsive would signal what I think would happen should the West Bank be annexed. I think it would create a rift that American Jews would be not just disinclined, but unable to square the circle of their support for Israel with its non-democratic nature.
Abby, would you like to comment further?
I'm not sure I understood why applying sovereignty over the settlements makes it non-democratic, but that's not, I don't think that's the topic.
We'll get back to you in a second.
I would say, first of all, I want to clarify that I'm no longer president, so I'm not responsible for whatever happened. It's another president's problem. But I will say, what I think you're getting at least to me, we haven't really addressed, is the demonization of each other within our communities. And I will just speak personally for Central Synagogue. I think my rabbi's here, so I hope she forgives it. The candor, Angela Buchdahl, whom I adore, is that it has been dispiriting beyond belief, and during my tenure, we both struggled it, Rabbi Buchdahl and myself, to see not just that we had, and it's overly simplistic to say red states and blue states, in the Israel context, but you all know what I mean for the shorthand, to watch a very low-grade kind of blacklisting of each other that was beginning, which is that we cannot talk about this honestly in rooms that feel not just safe in that crunchy Oprah word that I feel is overused, safe spaces, but really being able to wrestle with what we're all struggling with, because I think we all are, in honest ways, without somehow being labeled that you are with us or against us. To me, that's a chilling effect in the Jewish world that we need to address and be honest about, and to me is part of the problem with worrying. We should wring our hands about the diaspora, but part of what we should be paying attention to is what we're doing to each other, to silence each other about what we need to talk about, what the anxiety about our democratic values that some people are feeling. And so when a decision like this happens, I pray that we can actually begin to be more honest about why it's so complicated and so difficult right now.
Okay, just one shout out, by the way, for Rabbi Buchdahl, who really inspired all of us, I think, last night with her incredible rendition. So thank you for all you do. We haven't spoken at all about American Jewish Orthodoxy and its relationship to Israel. That at the same time that we're talking about a growing chasm between Israel and American Jewry, we have one major sector of American Jewry that, number one, is growing in numbers. Number two, is intensifying its commitment to Israel, almost normative now for every graduate of an Orthodox day school to spend a full year of study in Israel. That's an incredibly transformative experience, and it's changed the map of American Orthodoxy. Could you envision a scenario where American Jews, primarily conservative and reform, are drifting away for some of the reasons we've mentioned, including what might be called the hypothetical scenario of the death of the two-state solution, while Orthodox Jews, extremely enthusiastic about the direction Israel is going, become much more intense and much more identified. They, in turn, then become the base of pro-Israel support within the American Jewish community. What do you think would be the scenario under those circumstances? Dan, I know you're beginning a new book on studying American Jewish life. Would you want to give us a sense there?
First, can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay. Let me make a comment on the previous question.
By all means.
Sure. And I think when we say annexation, first of all, Netanyahu is known to make a lot of promises pre-election, so I wouldn't take those too seriously. But that could be the direction. And regardless of how the majority of the American Jewish community will feel, and I think the statements that we heard here would be quite reflective of that. Israelis are not anti-peace. They're going away from the two-state solution because they have lost the belief that there's anyone on the other side who is reciprocating. They're not anti-peace. They're anti-two-state solution. And so the majority of Israelis, by the way, the vast majority of Israelis, and we can see that in the shift from the 1990s when Avodah was the major party, the pro-peace, today we have the center. It's not a gimmick. When Israelis call themselves center, that is saying we want to believe in peace, but with whom? We don't have anyone on the side, so we're not the right, okay, the far right, let's say, who is willing to fight for more and more of the land, the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria. They're saying, we're going to hold out, we'd like to have peace one day. What would annexation look like is a huge question. Would it be just the gushim, just the settlement blocks? I think that would be quite consensus. Would it be also more outlying settlements beyond the security fence? Is there someone on the other side? Do you have an Abbas like Anwar Sadat coming to the Knesset, or not an Abbas, whoever comes after him, coming to the Knesset and speaking in front of the Israeli people and saying, we want peace with you, we are willing to stop the incitement and the terror? That's something that I think Israelis are waiting for. And they don't want to say it, but they're too insecure to take any more risks after the fall of Oslo, the Second Intifada, and after the Gaza withdrawal and what Israeli society has suffered in terms of rockets. They're not willing to take any more risks. Israelis speak with a bravado, but they're quite insecure from that perspective. I think they deeply want peace. We do also need to consider, and this might radically transform the relations, at least for a certain period of time, and I'll tie this into your question, maybe the two-state solution is dead. Maybe the sides missed their chance. I'm not going to assign blame here. Maybe the sides missed their chance, and we need to look at new mappings, new configurations of what that looks like, new confederations, new political realities that I don't think anyone is imagining or throwing out there. You're going to see a lot more as the American Orthodox community grows. Right now, the American Orthodox community is 10% and growing. It's the only part of the American Jewish community with positive birth rates and retention rates. Okay, so in another, we have demographers at the Institute who look at these things. In another decade, 2 decades, it's going to be up to 20%. Okay, they're going to be a lot more willing to accept and jump out in the lead of supporting Israeli moves on that sense. As far as the 80% of American Jewry, there's going to be a lot of questions. Who's at fault for seen as tanking any kind of peace process? Is it Israel seen at fault, running out? Maybe if Trump gets another term and feeling overconfident, is the Israeli government going to take the lead on that? Or is it going to be more Palestinian rejectionism? And those are going to be key issues that play into that equation. As the face of American Jewry changes, you are going to see a much louder voice, a small c conservative voice, right-wing pro-Israel voice within the American Jewish community, who's not going to question Israeli politics. They're going to accept the right-wing version of Israeli politics. And then the question is, how does the rest of American Jewry, I think, respond to that?
Just to one word of amplification on that. There's no way that Orthodox Jews would become the majority of American Jews. We start with a percentage of 10%, it's not going to grow to 50%. What very well may happen is the pool of those Jews concerned and committed enough to take an active public role in Jewish life, specifically in terms of pro-Israel advocacy, that pool is likely to become increasingly Orthodox, probably majority, I would say certainly within the foreseeable future. If not tomorrow, 10 years from now. The actual data is that 35% of Jews under age 5 are Orthodox Jews in America today. And the retention rates are very, very high. This in turn, as the end points to, will cause some rethinking of how American Jews position themselves on public policy matters and on pro-Israel matters. We can talk about this further, but I really would like to give people in the audience a chance to it has to be a question. We have roving mics. We have staff and roving mics. I'll call on people, but first of all, let me see hands. So, all right, the woman over here on the far left, my far left. Do we have staff here? Hold on to mics. Yeah.
See if you can shout as loud as you can, and we will repeat the question.
Yeah.
The extra mic.
Yeah.
Okay, but she has a mic.
Test.
Yeah. We're going to take 3 questions at a time.
Okay. Well, mine will only be one. Thank you very much for being here and sharing your thoughts with us. Here's my question. We've talked a lot about solidarity, about community of conscience, about there's more that unites us than there is that divides us. My question is as follows. How do we, as conservative, liberal, whatever, other than Haredi Jews, how do we have solidarity with those who disagree with poskim, with sages over hundreds and hundreds of years that clearly state that a Jew is one, ... comes from a Jewish mother, what have you. How do you find solidarity with someone who disparages, does not recognize, totally, and I apologize for the verbiage, but you're a bastard Jew?
We'll take 2 more. Woman here in the center. Do we have mics?
Thank you very much. My name is Geffen. I'm a student at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And my question is, I feel talking about the connection between diaspora and Israelis is a lot of lack of knowledge. I feel like as a secular Jew in Jerusalem, I know for my friends, most of them don't know other streams like conservative and reform. And also I saw in the poll that 59% of American Jews haven't even visited Israel. So I was wondering how, as like young generation, we can strengthen the connection, because I think it's vital for both sides.
Okay, gentleman here on the left. Oh, let's take a question from the right here. How about first row here, gentleman here, right in the front row. Go ahead. Can we get a?
Ambassador, you made the comment about not getting divorced, but I think that there are 2 different communities that are of great concern in the United States. And they're the adults like us, and by adults I only mean by age, that were raised to love Israel. And that love is hard to breach no matter what kind of actions go on in Israel. There is the younger generation which over the next 20 years becomes an existential question for Israel with regard to support, including political support from the United States. And I think they are yet to be married to Israel. And Abby said pride, and it is pride and a belief in a sense of decency that the younger generation appears to find difficult to accept. So the question is that an important distinction as far as Israel is concerned? Do they recognize that's an important distinction between those who they know love Israel, whether they agree with them or not, and those who in fact may not have developed that love affair?
We'll take more questions later, but let me give a chance to the panelists. Ambassador Dayan, I think the last question was directed to you directly, so why don't you got it right there.
Thank you. Yeah, of course you are right. Look, if I have to pinpoint one issue to which I would devote most of the energy and most of the resources of the American Jewish community, and I echo here things that we already said, would be Jewish education. I think the crisis of Jewish education in this country is existential for the Jewish community here. And I consider myself a product, a good product, a bad product, I don't know, but a product of two things: my family and the amazing Jewish educational network, not necessarily religious, actually quite non-religious Jewish educational network that existed in Buenos Aires, Argentina during my formative years there. And you can maintain Judaism first generation without proper Jewish education, probably second generation. It will be extremely challenging to maintain Jewish life, thriving Jewish life here in the third generation without proper Jewish education. And I remember always, I quote a very good friend of mine, a young Reform rabbi, very committed to his Judaism, very committed to his Zionism, and he was in my office, and he's in the 30s, I believe, in his late 30s, and he told me, look, Dani, I have 3 kids. I simply cannot afford to give them Jewish education, proper Jewish education. And that is the crux of the matter. If the American Jewish community will not confront that crisis, it makes me quite pessimistic. And the attachment or non-attachment to Israel derives from that mainly. And yes, I understand. I also understand that many of the things that concern the American Jewish community's relationship with Israel has nothing to do with Israel, but have a lot to do with currents in the American society. And one of the paradoxes that always puzzles me, and it's not necessarily about the younger generation, the millennials, actually is regarding the more adults, is I still cannot explain to myself, or probably I can, but is the following paradox. In December 2016, in December 2016, the URJ, the United Reform Judaism, chaired by my good friend Rabbi Rick Jacobs, called on President Obama to veto a resolution condemning the settlements in the Security Council of the United Nations. They published, I was quite surprised and pleased, they published a statement calling on President Obama to veto that resolution. Exactly 1 year later, the same organization published a statement calling on President Trump not to move the embassy to Jerusalem. Now, I don't have any other explanation for that change of position regarding settlements and Yerushalayim, but the person that inhabits the White House. So it's easy to blame Israel, but I'm not sure that difference between those two extremely different statements by the URJ, and the URJ here is just one example, there were other organizations also, can be explained by something that Israel did or intended to do or will do, rather by American domestic politics.
Elliot?
Thank you, Ambassador. I want to, this might not work, I want to try to answer all 3 questions at once by way of a joke, or a story about a joke. I have a nephew in Jerusalem, my sister-in-law made Aliyah, and so Yonatan lives in Tivon up in the north, and worse than dad jokes are uncle jokes, so it's my responsibility, he's bilingual, to tell him dumb jokes. So I go in and I say, the oldest one of all, when I was there last summer, I said, why is 6 afraid of 7?
7, 8, 9.
Because 7, 8, 9. Thank you. Everyone get it? So you don't get it. Why is 6 afraid of 7? Because 7, 8, 9. He bursts out laughing, unlike all of you. And he runs to say, Abba, Abba, Abba. Lama shesh mefached mesheva. Ki sheva shmona tesha. And his father looks at him and realizes that the joke doesn't translate. We speak different languages. We speak different languages, not just linguistically, but culturally, politically, geopolitically. And so to the question there of how do you bridge the chasm between those who wouldn't even acknowledge some of us as Jews, to the secular Israeli who's asking the question of how do we get Israelis to understand American religious pluralism and American Jews to understand the day-to-day reality of Israel, and to the gentleman here who's asking the question of how do we bridge the generations of those, for lack of a better term, who have this sort of instinctual, reflexive, protective instinct towards Israel, and those who don't. I think it all comes down to relationships. I think it comes down to figuring out not just the birthrights, but the reverse birthrights. I think look, I was just this morning at a table of AJC about dialogues between the Muslim community and the Jewish community. I think Jews need to have conversations not just with Muslims or Christians, but with Jews. And I think that is why the work of AJC is so very important.
I want to just agree with Elliot, if I can call you Elliot, because Elliot is in my book, My Jewish Year, and part of what I was trying to do in that book is cross divides, as he's suggesting, within ourselves. And the way that I find that conversation unites is to talk about Tzom Gedalia, one of the 6 fasts that very few people actually stop eating on, except for the Orthodox. Or let's talk about Shavuot and what it means to stand at Sinai. And without being kind of utopian about it, it was an extraordinary laboratory for me to be able to go interview Elliot about Tu B'Shvat or Yom HaZikaron, and then go talk to David Ingber, who's at Renewal, and then talk to somebody at Chovevei Torah, who is in Modern Orthodox, and then to sit with Avi Shafran, who is at Aguda Israel. And we were all having a conversation where no one was questioning whether I had a right to ask these questions or to be in dialogue with them. And Sharon Kleinbaum from the quote-unquote gay synagogue, CBST. It was a time where I saw if we were able to kind of engage each other on tradition, something like sinat chinam, right? Baseless hatred, which comes up on Tisha B'Av. As soon as you're having that conversation about Jew against Jew, and that's why we lost the Second Temple, it is not some obscure remote idea. To me, we're having a conversation that is missing in our Jewish community, to me, about what unites us. It is not just some halcyon idea about Jewish ethics. It is what we've inherited and whether it matters today.
I love all those points, and I'll agree with all of them. I'll add a couple of other points referring to some of the questions. You know, I think, frankly, the fact that we can sit here and argue about all of these points and bring in people who are not in this argument, who are part of this argument. We're at an amazing time in Jewish history that, frankly, we can argue. It's been mentioned here just 75 years ago, the Holocaust, just 7 years ago, the founding of Israel. We're now at a time when this community is in such a place of prosperity and security, despite what's happened in the past year. And when Israel is in such a place of security and prosperity, despite rocket attacks, etc., that we can take time to fight amongst ourselves. And I think that's a good thing. And how do we fight amongst ourselves with keeping respect? If there are people denying other parts of the Jewish world identity, that is something that's obviously disrespectful. How do we engage the leaderships? We're not a united Jewish community. We never have been. We can get over that. We had a short period where the Jewish world was so threatened that we forgot our differences and united. That's a blip on the screen of Jewish history. Okay, this is the reality, and it's fine. We should accept it. We should embrace it. How do you go to a reform and a conservative and a non-denominational and a gay and an ultra-Orthodox rabbi and bring them all together and talk about what really matters? And that's what we have in common. That's Torah. That's Judaism. How do we do that respectfully? We're not going to agree. The ultra-Orthodox rabbi will not accept Reform Judaism or conservative Judaism because they see that, right? And we have that in many different directions, and that's okay. What we need, and I've spoken to many groups in Israel, in America, more liberal, more conservative, Reform, Orthodox, what have you, young, old. We need more of a sense of that Jewish peoplehood. Okay, we can't go back. One of the questions, talked about the older generation that was married to Israel. We can't go back. How do we move forward on this issue? How do we instill a sense of Jewish peoplehood? Okay, families, a big Jewish family. In Israel, I think I can say that education on the diaspora. And why is American Judaism so liberal? Why are they so naive? Israelis don't get it because they grew up, as Ambassador Dayan said very clearly, they grew up in a whole different setting of Jewish sovereignty, of struggling to survive. American Jews, how do you see where Israelis are coming from in that sense? How do you educate the other, okay, to our friend from Jerusalem here, just about the worldview of the other community? These are the two most major Jewish communities in the world. 80% of world Jewry lives in two communities today. And so we can't afford to fight. We can argue. We can't afford to fight. And if you can instill through Birthright, through reverse Birthright, through long-term programming, if you can get, just like the Orthodox, if you can get that with the other communities to send their kids on a gap year to see, they're not going to agree, they're not going to accept the worldview, but empathy, right? And if you can do it in both ways, the shlichim programs that you have, these are crucial to develop empathy, to be able to see the other community's worldview. We're not going to close the gaps, but we can at least bridge them significantly.
Ambassador Dayan, I know, wants to add a word.
Just two very brief remarks. The first one, don't give too much importance to fringe elements in the Israeli society. Always you will find a quote from someone that offended American Jewry. By the way, also vice versa. Sometimes American Jews forget that also Israeli has feelings. We sometimes also have feelings. When one of the leading publications, Jewish publications in this country, in the top headline in their website publishes an article that its headline says, Richard Spencer, the neo-Nazi, may be a despicable person, but he may be right about Zionism. Well, that also broadens the gap between us. So take everything into consideration, but not give too much. The second thing that I would like to say briefly is that I don't believe in reverse birthright, but I do believe in reverse AIPAC. I think that the American Jewish community needs a much more robust presence in Israel. Not by making Aliyah. I mean, I would like all of you to make Aliyah, obviously, but no, that's not what I mean. I think that we have done, Geffen, a very lousy job in educating ourselves about our brethren across the ocean. And I think that we don't have any other choice but ask our brethren across the ocean to do it by themselves and to have a robust presence in Israel that educates us. And one last remark, if you think that, if there are those in this country that think that they can win the empathy of Israeli Jews by means of publishing press releases in English in Manhattan, they are wrong. Press release in English in Manhattan may impress their members, but does not impress one Israeli. You have to be on the ground and influence, and yes, you can also lobby and educate and do PR. We did the lousy jobs. We are doing a lousy job in educating ourselves about you. Come to our help.
I know there are a ton of other questions. I'm not able to take them. Really, apologies, we are running out of time. Perhaps I can leave you, though, with three takeaway points that summarize some of this discussion and give some thought for further attention in the months and years ahead. Number one, I do want to go back to Ambassador Dayan's earlier comment that we are family, and the implications of that are very profound. It does mean, as he mentioned, the Blaustein-Ben-Gurion Agreement is an historical document, comes from a different time, a different place, different American Jewish community, and a different Israeli society. If we really believe that we're family, it calls for more intervention rather than less. Now, this is something that the AJC Task Force on Israel-Diaspora Relations is grappling with, but it suggests a fundamental sea change in our whole approach. If we really take solidarity seriously, it means more intervention, not hands off, and saying, that's your affair, not my affair. Number two, I want to pick up on Elliot's comment, which is jarring in its own way, but in many ways I think speaks to many of us, is that, and then picked up on by Dan, if the two-state solution is rapidly evanescing in front of us, the implications are, again, very, very profound. Israel's moral claim, or the case for Israel's moral claim inside the United States, is heavily based upon the viability of a two-state solution. Policy-wise, that's meant in terms of AJC that when we articulate where we are, we say we believe in the two-state solution as the only realistic solution to this 100-year-old conflict, the world's longest-running conflict at this point. That's a way of echoing what I call the moral case for Israel. If the two-state solution is not a reality, two major implications. Number one, the moral case for Israel, both inside the Jewish community and outside of it, has been badly attenuated. Number two is that if the alternative to the two-state solution is the one-state solution, or perhaps other possibilities or other models, we at AJC have not begun to consider them, nor do we really have any evaluation as to what that would mean. Realistically speaking, I think we have to at least grapple with hypothesis. It's like the National Security Council saying, what if? We have to ask ourselves that question, what if? I don't have the answer to it, but it's something I think that my colleagues and I in AJC are going to have to grapple with in the years ahead. Thirdly, what we started off with Elliot's sermon that I mentioned earlier about what are we talking about when we talk about Israel. We're often talking about ourselves. I would suggest we oftentimes have the capacity of scapegoating Israel for our problems. The problem of assimilation is very real. We don't like talking about it because it's inside our own families. It's my sister, it's my uncle, it's my best friend's cousin, my neighbor. As a result, we often shrink from that because it's going to cause divisions among ourselves. Reality is that the price of assimilation is very heavy. Number one, in terms of pro-Israel advocacy. Strong Judaism will make for strong pro-Israel advocates, as Abby mentioned. But it's also a sense that if Israel did everything that American Jews asked of her, in other words, two-state solution, end of settlements, religious pluralism, end of the chief rabbinate, if Israel did all of that, we would still have the major problem of a drifting away of American Jews from Israel because none of that addresses the problem of assimilation. Again, I and my colleagues have not been effective in addressing that over the last, I've been at it now for 37 years. I don't know what the future holds, but except to say, if we ignore assimilation, we ignore it at our peril, and we certainly should not be scapegoating Israel for what troubles us internally. With all that, I really would like to thank the panelists. I mentioned Dan's book, which I read and very much liked and recommend to you. I also gave very careful reading to Abby's book, My Jewish Year. It really is a masterpiece. So if you haven't read it, go ahead and do so. I've also read Rabbi Cosgrove's dissertation on Louis Jacobs, leading British Jewish intellectual. I look forward to the day I can recommend it to all of you. Thank you. Our next session begins immediately in the ballroom plenary.